They lented the aircraft after she was already buckled into her seat. The seatbelt sign still glowed overhead, the cabin door remained open, and the pilot's voice, calm, clipped, and final, cut through the speakers like a judgment being delivered. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to pause boarding briefly. There's an issue that needs our attention." Heads turned down the aisle. A few passengers let out tired sighs. Somewhere near row 18, a suitcase slammed against the jet bridge wall. In her seat, a 16-year-old black girl went completely still. Her fingers tightened around the worn strap of a canvas backpack she'd been carrying since middle school. Her name was Ava Monroe. She looked almost swallowed by the wide leather seat, knees drawn up, sneakers barely grazing the floor. Despite the warm cabin air, her hoodie was zipped all the way to her chin. The man seated beside her in the aisle glanced in her direction, then quickly looked away, as though lingering too long might pull him into a situation he wanted no part of. Ava felt it before anyone spoke, the familiar pressure in her chest, the sense that something unseen had shifted in the air. A flight attendant stopped beside her row. She looked to be in her mid-40s. Perfect, Ava thought. The woman wore that practiced smile, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "Sweetheart," she said gently, crouching down to Ava's level, her voice almost a whisper. "Could you come with me for just a moment?" Ava swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked. The flight attendant's smile faltered for Lenniff a second. "We just need to double-check a few things," she replied. The words were soft. The tone was not. From the cockpit doorway, Captain Jonathan Pierce observed the exchange with narrowed eyes. He'd been flying for this airline longer than Ava had been alive. He understood procedures. He understood risk. And lately, more than anything, he understood fear. Fear of headlines, fear of lawsuits, fear of becoming the man whose name was tied to the wrong call at the wrong time. He reassured himself that this was routine. He told himself it had nothing to do with her skin color, her age, or the way she sat so rigidly still it almost resembled guilt. He told himself many things. Slowly, Ava stood, acutely aware of every pair of eyes tracking her as she stepped into the aisle. Her backpack brushed against an armrest. Someone cleared their throat. Somewhere nearby, a voice whispered, "What's going on?" She wanted to vanish, or scream, maybe both. Instead, she followed the flight attendants toward the front of the plane, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain the entire cabin could hear it. In the galley, another crew member waited, a younger man, visibly nervous, hands clasped too tightly. "She's a minor," he murmured, not nearly as quietly as he thought. Ava heard him. The word minor landed like a label stamped across her forehead. She lifted her chin. "I'm allowed to fly alone," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "I have my ticket. I have my ID." The flight attendant nodded, her smile still fixed in place. "Of course you do. We just need to confirm a few details with the captain." Behind them, the jet bridge vibrated softly. The engines idled, releasing a low mechanical growl that felt like impatience humming through the aircraft. Captain Pierce scrolled through the file on his tablet once more. Unaccompanied minor, properly booked. Emergency contact listed. No visible red flags. Still, visible didn't always mean safe. He thought of training videos, compliance briefings, and lawsuits that all began the same way. The airline failed to act. A low murmur rippled through the cabin. Near the front, an older woman leaned into the aisle. "Is there a problem?" she asked, concern edging her voice rather than accusation. Across from her, a man shook his head. "If she's got a ticket, let the kid sit," he muttered. The flight attendant shot him a look sharp enough to silence him. "We're handling it, sir." Ava felt the sting of tears well behind her eyes. She hated that part most of all, hated how her body betrayed her even when her mind was screaming to stay strong. "Please stay calm," she whispered. "Can I call my dad?" The flight attendant hesitated, just long enough for Ava to notice. "In a moment," she said. "Let's speak with the captain first." Captain Pierce stepped out of the cockpit. Tall, gray at the temples, authority settled naturally into his posture, and the surrounding noise seemed to fade as he approached. He looked at Ava, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. It wasn't anger, it wasn't kindness, it was calculation. "Ava Monroe," he said, reading from the screen. She nodded. "You're traveling alone today?" "Yes, sir." "And where are you headed?" "Charleston. My grandmother's sick." Her voice cracked on the final word, and she hated that too. Pierce exhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of the moment now, the eyes watching him, the consequences balancing on a single decision. He imagined the reports that would follow, the questions that would come later. "We're just going to take a few minutes," he said, measured and professional. "We need to verify your guardian information before we can proceed." "It's all there," Ava replied, louder now. "My dad booked the flight. He's listed as my emergency contact. Everything's there." For a brief moment, Pierce met her gaze. Doubt crept in, not about the paperwork, but about himself. "Step off the aircraft," he said. The words hit like a dropped weight. A sharp collective breath moved through the cabin. The older woman was on her feet instantly. "That's absurd," she said. "You're holding all of us up over a kid who hasn't done anything wrong." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, please take your seat." His authority snapped back into place. She hesitated, then sat down again, her mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. Ava turned toward the door, her legs trembling beneath her. Every step down the aisle felt like a public reckoning. The whispers had grown louder now, some sympathetic, others irritated, a few sharp enough to sting as she reached the threshold. She stopped. "Please," she said, barely louder than a breath. "Can I just call my dad?" The flight attendant looked to Pierce. He gave a quick, curt nod. Ava pulled out her phone, fumbling with it as her hands shook. The screen blurred when the tears finally spilled, and she wiped them away angrily before pressing call. It rang once, twice. Then a voice she knew answered, steady, calm, and the relief hit her so hard her knees nearly gave out. "Dad," she breathed, "they're making me get off the plane." There was silence on the other end. Not panic, not confusion, just heavy, controlled quiet. "Where are you?" he asked. "Gate D9. "They stopped the flight?" Another pause, longer this time. "Stay there," he said, his voice lower now, changed. "I'm coming." The call ended. Ava looked up. The pilot was watching her from behind the cockpit glass, his expression unreadable. Outside, afternoon sunlight flashed against steel and concrete. The engines continued to idle, patient, relentless. None of them knew it yet, but the delay they'd ordered was about to turn into something else entirely. The jet bridge felt colder than the cabin, the air sharper, stripped of any pretense of comfort. Ava stood just outside the aircraft door, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the plane that was supposed to carry her away, now frozen in place. A ground crew worker paused at the bottom of the stairs, hands on his hips, eyes darting between the cockpit window and the gate desk. No one spoke to her. No one met her gaze. That silence was louder than the hum of the engines. Captain Pierce remained at the doorway, one hand resting against the frame. From here, he could see the entire scene he'd set in motion. A teenage girl standing alone, a cabin full of frustrated passengers, sealed inside metal and leather, a schedule bleeding away minute by minute. He told himself he was being responsible. He told himself that caution now would prevent disaster later. But beneath those reassurances lived a quieter truth. Once he'd decided she might be a risk, everything that followed bent itself around that assumption. The flight attendant who'd first approached Ava shifted her stance, heels clicking softly on the floor. Her name tag read, Denise Harper. She'd spent years perfecting that gentle voice, learning how to sound concerned without sounding apologetic. But standing beside a crying teenager, the performance felt thinner than usual. "Your father is on his way," Denise said, trying to steady the moment. "This will all be sorted out." Ava nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Inside the cabin, the murmurs sharpened. A man in a business jacket checked his watch for the third time in under a minute. "We're going to miss our connection," he said to no one in particular. 2 rows back, an older black man leaned into the aisle. "She didn't cause this," he said loudly. "You all did." Denise spun toward him. "Sir, please remain seated." "I am seated," he replied calmly, unblinking. The tension thickened, stretched tight as wire. At the gate desk, the station supervisor arrived, summoned by a clipped message from the cockpit. His name was Richard Sloan, late 40s, clean-cut, the type of man who trusted procedure because it made the world feel orderly. He listened as Denise spoke in a rushed whisper, her eyes flicking between Ava and Pierce. Sloan nodded slowly. "We'll need documentation," he said, "and a record of the delay." His gaze rested on Ava for a moment longer than necessary, not hostile, but calculating, measuring how much trouble she might become. Ava noticed. She always did. Her phone buzzed, a text from her father. "I'm parking. Be there in minutes." Relief washed through her, followed immediately by a spike of fear she couldn't quite explain. She trusted her father more than anyone. But she also knew what it meant when his voice went quiet, when his words turned precise. That wasn't comfort. That was preparation. Pierce retreated into the cockpit, the door sliding shut behind him with a heavy click. He settled into his seat, but didn't begin the checklist. The first officer glanced over. "You sure about this?" Pierce stared out through the windshield at the terminal windows, the slow movement of people behind glass. "I want this clean," he said at last. "No mistakes." The first officer nodded, doubt flickering in his eyes. Clean was no longer an option. That moment had already passed. 10 minutes stretched into 15. The delay spread outward, rippling beyond the gate. Monitors refreshed. Connection windows tightened. Somewhere in operations, a call came through asking for an explanation. Pierce provided one that sounded clean and reasonable. Verification, unaccompanied minor, standard procedure. Every word was technically accurate. The context, however, was not. Ava sat on a hard plastic chair near the gate, a bottle of water offered and untouched beside her. The tears had stopped, leaving behind a dull, hollow pressure behind her ribs that hurt more than crying had. She watched travelers move past her, some openly staring, others pretending she wasn't there at all. Out here in the open, she felt smaller than she ever had in her seat, as if being removed had been the point. Then she saw him. At first it was just the color, blue, faded at the seams. Then the white lettering across the back came into focus, unmistakable even from a distance. NASA. The crowd seemed to part without realizing why, drawn aside by something unspoken. Ava shot to her feet so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floor. "Dad?" she whispered. Samuel Monroe moved with quiet urgency, the kind that made space form around him. 62 years old, gray hair cut short, posture still straight. The jacket hung loosely on his frame, elbows patched, fabric sun-worn from years of use. He had worn it into meetings with senators, into classrooms full of wide-eyed children, and to funerals for men who never made it home. It wasn't a symbol to him. It was a record of a life lived. He reached Ava and pulled her into his chest, without a word. She buried her face in the familiar fabric, breathing in machine oil and laundry soap. For a brief moment, the world narrowed to that embrace. Then Samuel lifted his head, and his eyes found Captain Pierce across the gate. Pierce felt the impact like a physical strike. Recognition sparked unbidden, not of the man exactly, but of the jacket, the bearing, the way nearby staff straightened without knowing why. He stepped forward, suddenly aware of how many eyes were now watching him. "Sir," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Captain Pierce." Samuel didn't take it. "I know who you are," he replied evenly. His tone was calm, controlled, but there was steel beneath it. "You removed my daughter from your aircraft." Pierce opened his mouth, then closed it again. Sloan appeared beside him, sensing escalation. "Mr. Monroe," Sloan began, glancing at the phone in Samuel's hand. "We're just ensuring compliance." "My daughter is in compliance," Samuel interrupted, lifting his phone, the screen glowing. "Her documents, your policy, your logs, all time-stamped, all correct." Silence settled over the gate. Not awkward silence. The heavy kind, the kind that arrives when people sense the story is about to turn. Samuel shifted slightly, his gaze sweeping over the nearby passengers, the crew, the supervisors. "I spent 35 years designing systems where failure wasn't an option," he said, "where assumptions killed people, where hesitation had consequences." He looked back at Pierce. "I taught my daughter to follow the rules because rules matter. You followed a feeling instead." Pierce swallowed. His first officer had stepped out behind him now, eyes wide. Denise stood frozen, her practiced smile long gone. Sloan shifted his weight. "Sir, I understand." Samuel raised a hand, not aggressive, final. "You delayed a flight," he continued. "You isolated a child. You did it publicly. And you did it without cause." Then he locked eyes with Pierce. "So now you have a choice. You can correct this, or you can explain it in writing to people who will ask far harder questions than I will." For the first time since this began, Pierce felt the ground shift beneath him. He looked at Ava. Really looked. The red-rimmed eyes, the clenched jaw, the way she stood upright despite everything. Something inside him cracked. He nodded once. "We're resuming boarding," he said. His voice carried farther than he expected. "Miss Monroe will return to her seat." A collective breath released across the gate, sharp, almost audible. One woman clapped once before stopping herself. Ava looked up at her father, disbelief flickering across her face. Samuel gave a small nod. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll be right here." As Ava walked back down the jet bridge, her shoulders were straighter now. The engines began their low growl again, but this time it sounded different, not impatience, but momentum. Behind her, Samuel Monroe remained at the gate, the NASA jacket bright under fluorescent lights, watching until the door closed, already knowing this wasn't over. The cabin felt different when Ava stepped back inside, quieter, heavier. Conversations died mid-sentence as she moved down the aisle. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. The seat that had once felt like a trap now felt like a line she had crossed and survived. She slid into seat 21, her fingers brushing the armrest, grounding herself in something solid. The man beside her gave a small nod, this time not avoidance, but recognition. From the cockpit, Captain Pierce watched the cabin settle through the cracked door. His pulse hadn't slowed, thudding loud enough to drown out the checklist glowing on his screen. He had resumed boarding. He had done the right thing. "Too late," a quiet voice whispered. He pushed it down. There would be time for reflection later. For now, there was a flight to fly. Samuel Monroe remained standing. He positioned himself near the window, hands loosely folded, his posture relaxed in a way that spoke of long familiarity with high-pressure moments. A few feet away, Richard Sloan lingered, phone pressed to his ear as he murmured updates to someone higher up the hierarchy. Denise Harper had withdrawn behind the gate desk, her attention locked on the monitor in front of her. Her reflection stared back from the darkened screen, the earlier confidence drained away, replaced by something tight and fragile. Sloan ended the call and cleared his throat. "Mr. Monroe," he said carefully, "we're documenting the incident. Standard procedure." Samuel gave a slight nod. "Good," he replied evenly. "Documentation matters." Sloan hesitated, then added, "If you'd like to file a formal complaint." "I already have," Samuel said. The words landed with more force than any raised voice could have managed. Inside the aircraft, the final door sealed shut with a hollow, reverberating thump. The safety demonstration began, familiar and strangely calming. Ava stared down at the laminated card in the seat back pocket, the diagrams blurring as her thoughts raced ahead of her breathing. Her phone vibrated. A message from her father appeared on the screen. "I'm here. You're not alone." She swallowed, blinking quickly, and typed back, "Thank you." A moment passed before another message arrived. "I'm proud of you." Her chest tightened. This time, when the plane began to push back, the feeling that followed was something close to relief. Pierce felt the movement through the frame, a subtle but unmistakable shift that signaled commitment. There was no reversing course now. He focused on the runway ahead, the painted lines stretching out beneath the afternoon sun. He had executed thousands of takeoffs over the years. This one carried more weight than most. "Cleared for departure," the tower announced. Pierce responded, his voice steady and professional, betraying nothing. The aircraft surged forward, engines thundered, the ground fell away behind them. At the gate, the crowd dispersed, pulled back into personal schedules and private urgencies. But not everyone moved on. An older woman lingered near Samuel, her purse clutched close. "Sir," she said quietly, "you did right by her." Samuel met her gaze. "We all have a responsibility," he replied. She nodded and walked on. Sloan approached again, this time without the phone. "Corporate will want a statement," he said. "They'll reach out." Samuel adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "They already have my contact information." His tone remained polite, final. Sloan hesitated, then extended his hand. Samuel took it. The handshake was brief, transactional, not forgiveness. As the plane climbed, Ava felt the pressure shift in her ears, the familiar pop anchoring her back in her body. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the vibration of the cabin steady her. The worst was over. And yet, she sensed she didn't fully understand how moments like this lingered, how they echoed, how they quietly reshaped the way you moved through the world afterward. In the cockpit, Pierce handed control to his first officer and leaned back slightly as the autopilot engaged. Silence settled between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, the first officer broke it. "That was close." Pierce nodded. "Closer than it should have been." His jaw tightened as he stared ahead. "I let fear make the call." The admission surprised him with how easily it came. The first officer glanced over, but said nothing. Sometimes acknowledgement was enough. On the ground, Samuel Monroe walked toward the exit, the NASA jacket drawing the same quiet attention it always had. The air outside felt warmer, louder. He paused near a row of windows, watching the plane lift into the sky, a silver shape cutting through blue. His phone buzzed again, a message from an unfamiliar number, corporate communications. He didn't open it yet. He thought about the years spent in rooms where mistakes were examined piece by piece, where accountability wasn't optional. He thought about Ava sitting on that plane, learning something he'd hoped she wouldn't have to learn so soon. The world hadn't changed in 15 minutes, but something had shifted. Lines had been drawn, records created. Samuel finally opened the message, a request for a call, an apology offered in advance. He typed a brief reply. "We'll talk. After you've reviewed the footage and the logs." He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Above him, a thin white contrail stretched across the sky, slowly dissolving into the afternoon light. Samuel adjusted the jacket on his shoulders and turned toward the parking garage, his pace unhurried. This had never been about authority or reputation or the letters stitched into worn fabric. It had been about a decision made under pressure and the reminder that even small choices carry weight. And somewhere at cruising altitude, a 16-year-old girl looked out the window as the land fell away beneath her, carrying with her the knowledge that she had been tested, underestimated, and still allowed to rise. The call came just as the plane leveled off. The seatbelt sign was still illuminated, and the cabin sat in that brief suspended quiet that followed takeoff. Captain Pierce glanced at the console, then at his first officer, then at the incoming call from operations. He waited length a second too long before answering. "Pierce," he said. His voice sounded older than it had an hour earlier. "Captain," the voice on the other end replied, measured, controlled. "We're initiating a formal review of the delay at Gate D9. We'll need a preliminary statement before landing." Pierce closed his eyes for a moment. There it was. No anger, no accusation, just process, the kind that carried consequences without ever raising its tone. "Understood," he said. The line went dead. In seat 18C, Ava felt the vibration change as the aircraft settled into cruise. The city below had shrunk into patterns of light and shadow, everything from this height looking neat and manageable. She rested her forehead against the cool window, letting the glass slow her thoughts. Her phone buzzed, another message from her father. "They're asking questions now." That's how it should be. She stared at the screen, then typed back, "Are you okay?" The reply came almost immediately. "I've been okay for a long time today. Just reminded me why." 2 rows behind her, the older black man who had spoken up earlier leaned slightly into the aisle. "You did good," he said quietly. Ava turned, surprised. He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Takes courage to stand there when everyone's watching." She nodded, searching for words. "Thank you," she said finally. Satisfied, he leaned back into his seat. In the galley, Denise Harper wiped down a counter that was already spotless. She'd been reassigned mid-flight, pulled from cabin duties pending review. No one said it out loud, but she felt it, in the way the lead attendant avoided her eyes, in the sudden formality that crept into every interaction. She replayed the moment again and again, hunting for where it had gone wrong. The smile, the word sweetheart, the assumption she hadn't realized she was making until it was too late. For the first time in years, doubt settled in, persistent and unwelcome. On the ground, Samuel Monroe sat in his parked car, engine off, phone balanced in his hand as airport traffic streamed past. Messages stacked up, legal, communications, then a number he recognized from an old contact list. Federal Liaison. He exhaled slowly. The jacket lay folded on the passenger seat beside him, the NASA logo length hidden. He hadn't chosen it deliberately. It was simply what he'd been wearing. But symbols had a way of collecting meaning, whether you invited them or not. His thoughts drifted back to his years at the agency, to meetings where young engineers were dismissed because they didn't fit the room, to battles fought quietly with data, patience, and refusal to back down. Systems, he'd learned, rarely failed all at once. They broke through small choices, unchecked habits, moments of convenience. Today had been one of those moments. His phone rang. He answered without checking the screen. "Monroe?" "Mr. Monroe," a woman's voice replied, older, polished. "This is Marissa Caldwell from Corporate Affairs. First, let me say how sorry we are for what your daughter experienced today." Samuel listened, his expression unreadable as the apology unfolded, carefully phrased, legally sound. When she finished, there was a pause. "I appreciate the call," Samuel said at last, "but apologies are conclusions. I'm still interested in causes. Silence. Then we'd like to understand your concerns, she said. Samuel glanced up at the sky, now empty where the plane had been. You'll review your training protocols, he said, your escalation policies, and the footage. All of it? Then we'll talk. In the cockpit, Pierce dictated notes into the recorder, his voice precise and factual. He didn't soften the timeline. He didn't skip over the hesitation. When he finished, he leaned back, staring at the instruments. Flying had always been about control. Today had taught him something about humility. The first officer finally spoke. I think this changes things. Pierce considered that. I think it should, he said. Whether it will depends on people beyond this cockpit. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as afternoon faded. Passengers slipped into the quiet rituals of flight. Ava pulled her hoodie closer around her shoulders, exhaustion settling in now that the adrenaline had drained away. She thought of her grandmother, of the hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and tea, of the reason she'd boarded this plane at all. The world had tried to stop her. It hadn't succeeded. When the plane began its descent, the seatbelt sign chimed again. Ava straightened automatically, but this time the sound carried no dread. It was just a signal, a transition. And as the wheels touched down, she stayed steady. A brief wave of applause moved through the cabin, spontaneous, restrained, and over almost as soon as it began. Ava blinked, caught off guard, then smiled despite herself. At the gate in Charleston, Captain Pierce stood by the door as passengers filed past him. When Ava reached him, he met her gaze. Miss Monroe, he said quietly, I'm sorry. The words were plain, unembellished, and because of that, they carried weight. Ava nodded. Thank you. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition, and sometimes that was enough to start with. Samuel waited beyond security, leaning against a column, the jacket back on his shoulders. When Ava spotted him, she broke into a run, her backpack bouncing wildly. He caught her easily, arms closing tight. You made it, he said into her hair. So did you, she answered. Around them, travelers flowed past, lives brushing briefly before separating again. What had happened would become a report, then a meeting, then maybe a case study. For some, a lesson. For others, a minor inconvenience already forgotten. But for Ava and her father, it stayed something else entirely. A line drawn. A moment when standing still would have been easier, and choosing to move forward had mattered. As they walked toward the exit together, Samuel felt the familiar weight of the jacket settle on his shoulders. He didn't look back at the gate. There would be time later for calls, follow-ups, accountability. For now, there was just this. His daughter beside him, the steady hum of the terminal, and the quiet certainty that even in systems built on routine, change still began with a single decision: to speak, to stop, to insist on being seen. The story didn't end at the gate. It rarely did. By the next morning, footage had been pulled from 3 angles: gate cameras, cabin recordings, a security feed that showed Ava standing alone beneath harsh fluorescent lights, her backpack held tight to her chest like armor. No one edited it for effect. It didn't need help. The pauses said everything. The hesitation, the way authority drifted in one direction without instruction. Samuel Monroe sat at his kitchen table as dawn crept in, the video playing silently on his tablet. A mug of coffee sat untouched beside him. He watched Captain Pierce's posture shift when the call came in. Watched Denise Harper's smile falter when the words minor passenger were spoken aloud. He watched his daughter blink hard, forcing herself to stay upright. He didn't rewind. He didn't need to. The sequence had already carved itself into memory. His phone buzzed. Not corporate this time. An old colleague from Phoenix, retired now, white-haired, quietly respected, saw the footage. The message read, You want this handled quietly or correctly? Samuel stared at the words for a long moment. Then he typed back one word: correctly. At the airline's regional headquarters, a conference room filled before 9. Legal, operations, human resources, training. At the front, a screen displayed a paused frame from the footage. Ava caught mid-step. Pierce Leniff turned, Denise just behind him. No one spoke at first. The image was damning, not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. Marissa Caldwell sat at the head of the table, hands folded. She had spent 3 decades managing crises, and this one unsettled her. "We're not here to assign villains," she said carefully. "We're here to understand failure." A lawyer cleared his throat. "There was no policy violation," he began. Marissa raised a finger. "Not on paper," she said. "That's the problem." In Charleston, Ava sat at the kitchen counter while her grandmother slept in the next room. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and old books. Safe smells, familiar ones. She scrolled through her phone, Lenf expecting to see her face everywhere. It wasn't. Not yet. A local station mentioned a delay. Minor passenger. No names. No photos. Ava X-lend slowly. Part of her wanted the story told. Another part wanted it buried. Both feelings existed at once. Uncomfortable, but honest. Samuel joined her, setting down a glass of water. "They're reviewing it," he said. Ava nodded. "Are you mad?" He thought for a moment. "I'm focused," he replied. She smiled faintly. That was his version of anger. Controlled, directed, dangerous only to the problem itself. Back at headquarters, Denise Harper sat alone in a smaller room, a representative beside her flipping through notes. She hadn't slept. The memory replayed relentlessly. Her crouch, the word sweetheart, the moment she thought she was helping. "I've been doing this for 20 years, she said quietly. "I thought I was helping?" The representative nodded, sympathetic, distant. "Intent matters," he said, "but impact matters more." Captain Pierce joined from a hotel room near the airport, where he'd stayed overnight. The call connected, and he spoke without defensiveness. He didn't downplay what happened. He didn't offer excuses. "I made a decision under pressure," he said plainly. "And I allowed an assumption to replace verification where verification should have been enough." A pause followed. Then someone asked, "Would you make the same call again?" Pierce answered immediately. "No." The room went still. Marissa closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. "That," she said, "is where this begins." She turned toward the training director. "Pull the modules, all of them, especially the ones we rushed through operations. Map every escalation point where discretion can slide into bias." She shifted her gaze to legal. "We are not waiting for a demand letter." The lawyer frowned. "That exposes us." Marissa held his stare. "So does denial." By mid-afternoon, a draft plan circulated: mandatory retraining, revised protocols for unaccompanied minors, clearer language, fewer gray areas, less reliance on instinct, more emphasis on evidence. It was comprehensive, costly, necessary. Still, something felt unfinished. Samuel received the call just after lunch. Marissa's voice was calm, steady. "Mr. Monroe, we've completed an initial review," she said. "We'd like to meet." Samuel glanced across the table at Ava, who was working through homework, her pencil tapping softly against the page. "Tomorrow," he replied, "in person." The meeting took place in a modest office, not a boardroom, no skyline views, no marble floors, just a table, a few chairs, and a pot of coffee that had been sitting too long. Marissa arrived with 2 colleagues. Samuel came alone. He didn't wear the jacket this time, just a simple button-down, sleeves rolled to his forearms. Marissa spoke first. She outlined the findings, the changes, the commitments. When she finished, she folded her hands. "We failed your daughter," she said. The words weren't rehearsed. Samuel studied her face. He believed she meant them. He also knew belief wasn't enough. "What happens to them?" he asked. Marissa didn't avoid the question. "Denise Harper is on leave pending retraining and review," she said. "Captain Pierce has been temporarily grounded and reassigned to simulator duty." Samuel nodded once. "And the system?" Marissa hesitated. "We're fixing it," she said. "That takes time." Samuel leaned back slightly. "Then you should start now." He slid a thin folder across the table. It wasn't thick, just a few pages. Marissa opened it, her brow furrowed as she read. "Independent oversight for bias-related incidents, external audits, community advisory input, not punishment, structure, accountability without spectacle." "This is ambitious," Marissa said. Samuel met her eyes. "So is flight." Silence followed, not tense, thoughtful. Finally, Marissa nodded. "We can do this," she said. "It won't be easy." Samuel stood. It wasn't supposed to be. Outside, the afternoon light angled low, stretching long shadows across the parking lot. Samuel walked toward his car, feeling the weight of the day settle into his bones. He was exhausted, but it was a clean kind of tired, the kind that came from moving something heavy in the right direction. That evening, Ava finished her homework and joined him on the couch. "Are they going to change things?" she asked. Samuel looked at her, at the quiet steadiness in her eyes. "They're going to try," he said. She nodded. That was enough for now. Above them, planes carved invisible paths across the sky, each one a promise built on trust, systems, people, decisions. None perfect, all capable of doing better. In that small living room, a father and daughter sat together, knowing the moment itself had passed, but its echo would carry forward, shaping choices still to come. The formal statement appeared 3 days later, buried midway down the airline's website. The language was careful, restrained, almost apologetic. Without naming fear, it acknowledged a delay involving a minor passenger, confirmed an internal review, and promised improvements. For most readers, it faded into the background noise of a busy news cycle. Inside the system, it landed differently. At a training center outside Raleigh, senior instructors sat in a windowless room watching the footage play on a large screen. No sound, just faces, body language, the precise moment when procedure loosened and assumption stepped in. One instructor, a woman with 30 years in aviation safety, leaned forward. "Pause it there," she said. The screen froze on Denise Harper's hand, hovering inches from Ava's arm. "That," the instructor said, tapping the screen, "is where discretion turns into bias. Not because of malice, because of comfort, because no one taught her how to stop." The room remained quiet. No one clenlanged the point. No one needed to. That same morning, Captain Pierce reported to the simulator facility. His uniform jacket was folded over his arm instead of worn. The badge on his chest still carried significance, but not authority. Not today. A younger instructor greeted him at the entrance. "You'll be running scenario sets," she explained. "Minor passengers, edge cases." Pierce nodded. He welcomed it. The cockpit mock-up smelled of plastic and recycled air, familiar but stripped of ceremony. No prestige here, just process. He strapped in anyway, hands steady, ready to be corrected. Across the country, Samuel Monroe received an invitation he hadn't expected. A community forum, not a press event, no cameras, no statements for sound bites, just a room filled with airline employees, managers, and a handful of local leaders who wanted to talk without a script. He hesitated before replying. Then he remembered Ava standing alone at the gate, backpack clutched tight to her chest. He accepted. The forum was held in a Union Lennel near the airport. Folding chairs, burnt coffee, open faces, Samuel didn't wear the NASA jacket. He didn't need it. When he spoke, his voice stayed calm. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he said. "I'm here because systems don't change unless the people inside them actually feel the moment." A man near the back crossed his arms. "So what do you want?" he asked. Not angry, just worn down. Samuel met his eyes. "I want you to pause," he said. "Before the assumption, before the shortcut, before you decide someone doesn't belong." Ava wasn't there. She was back at school, back inside routines that looked unchanged from the outside. But the incident followed her in quieter ways, in the way teachers watched her a little longer than before, in the way friends asked questions they didn't quite know how to frame. One afternoon, a guidance counselor called her in. "If you ever want to talk about what happened," she said gently. Ava shrugged. "I talk about it with my dad." The counselor smiled. "That's good," she said. "Not everyone has that." At headquarters, Marissa Caldwell reviewed feedback from the forum. Some comments stung, others surprised her. One stood out. A baggage handler had written, "We don't need more rules. We need permission to slow down." Marissa underlined the sentence twice, then forwarded it to operations with a single note. "Read this. The revised protocols rolled out quietly. No slogans, no glossy videos, just clear instructions. Mandatory pauses. Defined escalation paths. A requirement that any removal of a minor from an aircraft be reviewed by 2 independent parties before action." It added minutes. It added friction. It added protection. Denise Harper completed her retraining without fanfare. She watched the footage again, this time with commentary layered over each moment. She wrote a statement she never sent, apologizing to a girl she didn't know how to reach. When she returned to duty weeks later, her smile had changed, less polished, more careful. Some colleagues noticed, some didn't. Captain Pierce finished his simulator sessions and returned to the line. On his first flight back, he paused longer than necessary during boarding, watching a family settle in, watching a teenager argue quietly with her mother, watching people simply be people. His first officer raised an eyebrow. Pierce shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he said. "Let it breathe." Samuel Monroe declined a follow-up interview request from a national outlet. "This isn't a headline," he said. "It's a process." Instead, he spent his evenings reviewing policy drafts when asked, offering notes, and stepping back when he wasn't. He understood now. His role wasn't to lead the change, but to insist it keep moving. One evening, after Samuel left the room, Ava noticed the NASA jacket draped over the back of a chair. She ran her fingers over the worn fabric, tracing the stitched letters. "Do you think they listened because of this?" she asked. Samuel looked at the jacket, then at her. "I think they listened because they were ready," he said. "Sometimes it just takes the right moment to make people hear." Outside, a plane passed overhead, lights blinking against the darkening sky. Ava watched until it disappeared. She thought of the gate, the silence, the pause before everything shifted. She understood now, change didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came quietly, carried forward by people willing to stop, look again, and choose differently. And somewhere in training rooms, cockpits, and meeting Lennels, that choice was being practiced, again and again. The ripple traveled farther than anyone expected. 6 weeks after the incident, a regional safety bulletin circulated through airline inboxes across the country. It did not mention Ava Monroe by name. The bulletin never named Charleston, and it never referenced Gate D9. Still, the moment it circulated, pilots, flight attendants, and station supervisors all knew exactly which incident it was dissecting. A minor traveling alone, a delay that technically fell within discretion, a chain of escalation that should have ended long before it did. The wording was detached and precise, almost sterile, but the message underneath was anything but subtle. At a retirement community just outside Toledo, Ohio, Captain Leonard Len Monroe read the notice on his tablet while nursing a cup of weak coffee in the common room. 72 years old, with 38 years in the cockpit, before mandatory retirement finally pulled him from the flight deck, he let out a slow breath and shook his head. "About time," he muttered under his breath. The man seated across from him glanced up. "About time for what?" Len tapped the screen with one finger. "For them to admit it. We trained an entire generation to trust their instincts more than the checklist." He leaned back, eyes drifting somewhere far beyond the room. "And instincts," he added quietly, "aren't always clean." That same afternoon, Captain Pierce stood behind a lectern in a modest auditorium, facing a room full of pilots attending recurrent training. He hadn't been invited as a case study or a cautionary example, but as a witness. The request unsettled him more than any formal reprimand ever had. He spoke without his uniform jacket, sleeves rolled up, voice steady. But the weight of what he carried settled heavily over the room. "I thought I was protecting the airline," he said. "I thought I was protecting myself." He paused, scanning faces, some doubtful, some engaged, others uncomfortably familiar with the reasoning he was describing. "What I was really doing was filling in gaps I had no right to fill." He walked them through the moment itself, the pause, the uncertainty, the decision. There was no dramatization, no attempt to soften the edges. He simply told it as it happened. When he finished, the room stayed silent. No one clapped. No one needed to. Meanwhile, back in Charleston, Ava stood on a small stage in her high school auditorium, fingers clenched around a folded sheet of paper. She had been asked to speak at an assembly focused on travel safety. Her first instinct had been to decline. Then she remembered the silence at the gate, and how silence could feel an awful lot like consent. She cleared her throat and began. "I didn't feel brave," she said. "I honestly thought I was going to throw up." A soft wave of nervous laughter passed through the room, easing the tension. "I followed every rule," she continued, "and I still got singled out. That messes with your head." She lifted her eyes and met theirs. What helped wasn't someone yelling. It was someone standing next to me and saying, "Stop." She never said her father's name. She didn't need to. Afterward, a teacher approached her, eyes bright. "You made them listen," she said. Ava shook her head gently. "They were already listening," she replied. "They just needed a reason." Samuel Monroe heard about the assembly from a neighbor before Ava mentioned it herself. Later, over dinner, she told him the whole story. He listened closely, pride clear in his expression even though he said little. "You know," he said eventually, "there are people twice your age who still haven't figured out how to do that." Ava smiled. "Stand there?" she asked. "Tell the truth," he corrected. At the airline, change continued. Uneven, imperfect, but real. Some managers embraced the shifts wholeheartedly. Others complied because compliance felt safer than pushing back. A few chose early retirement rather than adapt. From day one, new hires were trained differently. Less mythology, more accountability. The phrase "slow the moment" began appearing in internal memos, then crept into briefings, and eventually became habit. Denise Harper transferred to a different route. Fewer unaccompanied minors, fewer edge cases. Still, the memory stayed with her. Whenever a young passenger approached her podium, she often paused just a little longer than required. Asked one extra question, really listened to the answer. It cost her a few seconds each time. She paid them gladly. Samuel turned down another invitation, this one from a policy institute eager to place him on a panel. "I'm not the story," he said, "and I don't want to become the shortcut." He understood how quickly attention could turn into performance, how easily systems leaned on symbols instead of substance. He stayed where he was most effective, quiet, available, unyielding when it mattered. Months later, at another airport, another gate, a different teenager stood uncertainly at the counter, ticket in hand. A supervisor glanced at the screen, then back at the girl. She took a breath. "Let's slow this down," she said. The words came easily now. No spotlight, no drama, just a pause, exactly where a pause belonged. The flight left on time. Ava never heard about that moment. She didn't need to. Change rarely announces itself to the people who set it in motion. It moves sideways, behind the scenes, through ordinary rooms and decisions that seem small at the time. But it moves. One evening, as summer settled in, Ava and Samuel sat together on the porch, watching the sky darken. A plane crossed overhead, flying low and steady, its lights blinking in a practiced rhythm. Ava tracked it with her eyes until it disappeared into the distance. "Do you think it'll stick?" she asked. Samuel didn't answer right away. He weighed the question and everything behind it. "Only if people keep choosing it," he said at last. "Every single time." Ava nodded slowly. She understood now that what had happened at the gate hadn't been a conclusion. It was a beginning. An introduction to how power actually worked, how dignity was protected, and how being underestimated never meant being without leverage. Above them, the sky stretched wide and unconcerned, holding countless routes at once. Somewhere within all those intersecting paths, a quieter change kept unfolding, not driven by outrage or spectacle, but by the steady, deliberate act of pausing, of seeing clearly and choosing better. Time moved the way it always did. It softened the sharpest edges without erasing what had happened. By autumn, the story stopped circulating altogether. No more internal memos, no more hushed meetings. The airline's attention shifted back to weather disruptions, fuel costs, and the routine crises that crowded executive schedules. For most people, the incident faded into a footnote. For Ava, it settled deeper. It changed how she noticed the world. She realized how often she scanned a room now, how quickly she read faces. Authority no longer felt abstract or distant. It felt personal, fragile, conditional. She learned to recognize the instant before a decision tipped one way or another, the breath people took before choosing comfort over fairness. It aged her in ways no classroom ever could. Samuel observed the change carefully. He didn't try to protect her from it. He knew that would miss the point entirely. Instead, he talked to her. The same way he had spoken to junior engineers years earlier, late nights in fluorescent-lit labs, voice calm and direct, never evasive. "You didn't lose anything that day," he told her once as they stood side by side at the sink, washing dishes. "You gained sight." Ava nodded. She knew it was true, even if seeing more clearly came with its own cost. At the airline, Captain Pierce felt that cost as well. It surfaced in small pauses, in the extra second he took before signing off on decisions that once would have felt automatic. Some colleagues joked about it. Others noticed quietly and began adjusting their own habits without saying a word. He no longer needed to be sure he was right. He needed to be sure he was fair. That difference reshaped everything. Months later, a memo landed on his desk outlining a new mentorship initiative for young passengers interested in aviation careers, inspired by feedback from the Minor Passenger Review. Pierce stared at the screen longer than necessary. He pictured Ava in that seat, backpack clutched close, eyes wide, but unbroken. He approved the proposal without changing a single line. Denise Harper faced her own reckoning more quietly. On her days off, she began volunteering as a tutor, working with students who reminded her, uncomfortably, of the girl at the gate. The first sessions were stiff and awkward. Then something loosened. Listening came more naturally. Assumptions slowed. She never spoke about the incident, but she carried it with her, like ballast that kept her steady. Ava's guidance counselor suggested she apply for a summer program centered on leadership and ethics. Ava laughed when she heard it. "I'm not a leader," she said. The counselor raised an eyebrow. "You stood your ground when people older and louder than you tried to push you aside," she replied. "That counts." That night, Ava lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the gate. Not the fear this time, but the moment she asked to call her dad. The moment she refused to disappear. She submitted the application the next day. When she asked Samuel to read her essay, he didn't correct a thing. He only said, "This sounds like you." She smiled, relieved. She was learning that having a voice mattered, and that clarity wasn't something you were born with. It was something you earned by surviving moments that tried to take it away. At a regional aviation conference, Marissa Caldwell spoke on a panel about operational trust. She didn't name names. She didn't tell the story outright. But when she said, "Systems fail when we confuse intuition with wisdom," heads nodded across the room. Some people took notes, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That was enough. The jacket stayed in the closet most days now, folded, at rest. Samuel no longer needed it to make his point. He'd already made it. Still, sometimes when Ava passed it on her way out the door, she brushed her fingers against the sleeve. A private reminder, not of power, but of presence. One evening, as winter approached, Ava and Samuel stood by the airport fence near their home, watching planes lift off one by one into the darkening sky. The engines thundered at first, then softened as each aircraft climbed, carrying its passengers into the night. Ava leaned back against the cold metal railing. "I don't actually hate flying," she said suddenly. Samuel turned to her surprised. "No?" She shook her head. "I hate pretending nothing happened," she clarified, "but I don't hate the sky." Samuel smiled, the kind of quiet pride that didn't need words to explain itself. "That's how you know it didn't win," he said. Above them, a plane curved eastward, its lights blinking in a steady, familiar pattern. It carried passengers who would never know her name, who would never hear what had happened at that gate. And that was fine. The change Ava had helped set in motion didn't need recognition to exist. It lived in pauses, in questions asked twice, in decisions slowed just enough to land on the right side of fairness. She watched until the aircraft vanished, then turned toward the parking lot. Tomorrow would bring its own tests, its own assumptions. But she felt ready now, not because she was fearless, but because she understood something most people took years to learn. Dignity wasn't something you were handed. It wasn't granted by permission. It was claimed quietly the moment you refused to step aside because you knew you belonged. By the time spring returned, the incident had shifted from memory to reference point. It surfaced in training materials, policy footnotes, and conversations that began with "remember when" and ended with "let's not do that again." The airline never issued a sweeping announcement declaring transformation. It simply started behaving differently, one decision at a time, one gate at a time. Ava felt the difference the next time she flew alone. A different airport, a different crew, the same familiar nerves. She handed over her boarding pass and waited, for the pause, for the look, for the question that lingered just a second too long. It never came. The agent scanned the ticket, smiled, and waved her through. "Have a good flight," she said, already turning to the next passenger. Ava walked on, heart racing anyway. Then, gradually, it slowed as the jet bridge opened ahead of her. The absence of friction felt strange, almost unreal. She took her seat and finally ex-lend, realizing only then how tightly she'd been bracing herself. Captain Pierce learned about that flight through an internal note commending smooth operations. No incident, no delay, no review required. He read it twice, then closed the file. He'd learned that success was often invisible. No footage, no statements, just people moving forward unharmed. He preferred it that way now. Denise Harper received a handwritten card from one of the students she tutored. "Thank you for listening." The letters were uneven, carefully formed. Denise sat at her kitchen table and read the words again and again, letting them land. She had underestimated the power of that simple act. She placed the card in a drawer, not as absolution, but as a reminder. Ava Monroe watched all of this from a distance, resisting the impulse to check in, to ask for updates, to make sure the changes were holding. He understood how easily vigilance could turn into control. He trusted the structures he had pushed for, not because they were flawless, but because they were shared. Accountability didn't belong to one person. It belonged to anyone willing to keep the door open. One afternoon, Ava came home holding an envelope. She stood in the doorway, eyes bright, disbelief and pride tangled together. "I got in," she said. Samuel smiled, slow, steady. "Of course you did." She laughed, shaking her head. "No," she said, "I really got in." He pulled her into a hug, the moment grounding them both. That evening, as they sat together, Ava finally asked the question she'd been carrying for months. "If you hadn't come that day," she said quietly, "what do you think would have happened?" Samuel considered it carefully. "The plane would have left," he said, "and you would have carried that moment alone." Ava nodded, feeling the weight of it settle. "But you did come." "Yes," Samuel said, meeting her gaze. "And someday you'll be the one who shows up for someone else." The sky deepened through layers of dusk, planes tracing silent paths overhead. Ava watched them, feeling something finally settle into place. The story had begun with a stop, a pause, a moment of doubt. It was ending differently, with movement, with direction, with the quiet understanding that even when systems failed, people could still choose to be better than the moment demanded, to ask more of themselves. And that choice, she knew now, was the real journey. The room was quieter than Ava expected. No cameras, no banners, just a long table, a wall of windows, and a view of planes lifting into the sky at steady intervals, their engines a distant hush. The meeting had been scheduled for late afternoon, when the building thinned out and decisions had space to breathe. Ava sat beside her father, hands folded, posture composed, the calm of someone who had learned how to hold her ground without hardening. Across from them, Marissa Caldwell adjusted a folder and waited until the door clicked shut. She didn't rush. She didn't fill the silence. "We're here to close the loop," she said evenly. "Not to celebrate, not to justify. To set a standard." The phrase landed with weight, the kind that felt earned, not performative. Ava studied the faces around the table. Operations, training, legal. Each carried a different slice of responsibility, and none of them treated this as a favor being extended. Samuel gave a single nod. He'd learned long ago that endings mattered far less than what followed them. He didn't speak right away. He listened. Marissa laid out the measures already underway. The oversight panel had confirmed revised escalation steps, now embedded directly into systems that couldn't be overridden by habit or convenience. She spoke plainly, without polish or corporate flourish. When she finished, she slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "This is the commitment," she said, "publicly filed, audited, reviewed every year." Samuel read it carefully, expression unreadable, then passed it to Ava. She scanned the page and felt something settle in her chest. It wasn't relief. It was alignment. The language was precise, the timelines concrete, the accountability measurable. This wasn't an apology dressed up as progress. It was a structure designed to hold pressure. Ava looked up. "This makes space for people who don't have someone to call," she said quietly. Marissa met her gaze. "That's the point." The meeting ended without ceremony. No posed handshakes, no press-ready statements. When they stepped outside, the evening air had cooled, loosening the day's grip. Samuel paused by the railing and watched a jet climb, banking west. "This is where it sticks, Bankade," he said. Ava nodded. She understood now. Change survived through repetition, not recognition. Weeks passed. Summer arrived with heat and noise and motion. Ava attended the leadership program, listening more than she spoke. She learned where systems bent and where they broke. She learned how to ask for clarity without apologizing, how to slow a room without stopping it altogether. When her turn came to present, she didn't tell the story the way people expected. She talked about pauses, about the power of stopping just long enough to make a better choice. The room leaned in, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Captain Pierce followed the updates from a distance. He didn't insert himself. He flew his routes, ran his checklists, practiced the pause. He'd learned the hard way. When a junior pilot once asked why he took so long during boarding, Pierce answered simply, "Time spent early saves damage later." He left it there. The lesson didn't need decoration. Denise Harper finished her volunteer semester and signed up for another. She wasn't looking for forgiveness. She was looking for practice. Each student reminded her how quickly assumptions formed when comfort went uncleanlanged. So she cleanlanged them, daily, quietly. The work wasn't glamorous. It mattered. At the airline, the oversight panel released its first report. It wasn't flattering. It was honest. It named gaps and set deadlines. Some executives bristled. Others leaned forward. The stock moved as it always did, indifferent to virtue, responsive to stability. Stability grew from trust. Trust came from consistency. The system began to learn. On a clear evening near the end of summer, Ava and Samuel stood once more by the airport fence, the metal warm beneath their hands. Planes rose and fell in steady rhythm, each carrying hundreds of small lives, intersecting briefly before splitting off again. Ava felt the familiar flutter of nerves and let it pass. "I think I know what I want to do," she said. Samuel didn't ask. He waited. "I want to work on systems," she continued. "The boring parts, the parts people ignore until they fail." Samuel smiled, the quiet kind that didn't seek credit. "That's where the future lives," he said. They watched another plane lift, its lights blinking steadily against the deepening blue. Ava thought of the gate, the silence, the moment when everything balanced on a breath. She thought about how small decisions multiplied, how dignity could be defended without spectacle. She understood now that belonging wasn't permission granted by others. It was a fact asserted through presence and protected by structure. The story would keep moving, not as a headline, but as habit. In training rooms where instructors paused a second longer. In cockpits where pilots chose evidence over instinct. At gates where a supervisor said, "Let's slow this down," and meant it. The work wouldn't end. It would repeat. That was the point. Ava turned from the fence and walked toward the car, the night warm and ordinary, the future wide and unafraid.